Hey everybody, welcome back to our usual weekly podcast. My name is Patrick Tan, the General Counsel for ChatArgos, the blockchain analytics firm made famous for outing Binance's 1.4 billion BUSD stablecoin under collateralization. With me, as usual, every week, Jonathan Reiter, our CEO and Chief Data Scientist. Glad to have you guys join us. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules excuse me, to listen in to the podcast. Now, this week, what we're going to talk about, interesting week this week. I'm sure all you Bitcoin maxis will be really pleased with what has happened, but don't be too happy too quickly because we have some thoughts as to what's going to happen next. So we'll talk about Grayscale's attempt to convert GBTC into an ETF and why we don't actually think that that's actually a sincere attempt or application, if you will. Next, we'll talk a little bit about the US Treasury Department's proposed legislation that would govern digital assets in general. And finally, we'll talk about Genesis and DCG again, and the sweetheart deal that Genesis appears to be offering DCG. Why we think that the creditors of Genesis are in kind of a really bad situation just simply because of the sheer scale of the amounts that DCG owes to Genesis and why it's not going to go well just based on some existing bankruptcy law that exists in the US. But let's just dive straight in to GBTC. Let's talk a little bit about, this thing has been sadly a little bit misreported. Okay, because
some of the headlines were completely wrong.
Yeah. Some of these headlines are extremely aggressive. I mean, I'm just as pleased as the next guy that maybe will get a Bitcoin spot ETF. But let's go back to the genesis of this entire mess. Now, whatever you like to say about it, to begin with, I never thought that it was a good idea that the CFTC approve a Bitcoin futures for the CBOE and the CME, and that's how these things started off, because this was going to spark off a chain of events that would have highly unintended consequences and make a bit of a mess for the SEC down the road.
Yeah, so the first applications for ETFs are very old, like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
The Winklevoss and all kinds of really old stuff. And then similarly, applications for futures and things came up. And it is a bit of a strange, at this point, almost ancient history that initially, there were a number of fund vehicles set up. The thing that is now GBTC, not the old, maybe the oldest, whatever, but certainly the largest now, continuously operating. And then some futures got approved. And there is an inconsistency between not allowing, spot ETFs and allowing futures that is odd. It may or may not be a tenable position long term, but it's always felt weird. Yeah, and different organizations in the U.S. are responsible for approving the two different products.
Yes.
I guess they coordinate-ish, right?
Yeah, they should. That's how, is it too soon? That's how 9/11 happened. So...
that's literally the finding of the commission.
That's exactly how it happened. So, one of the things that puzzled me at the time was that a futures product would have been approved because where are you getting your price from? And I'm not saying that, you think about in terms of commodity futures and stuff like that, some of these things are pretty well established. Rice was actually the Rice was the oldest futures contract in the Japanese.
And that was deliverable.
And that was deliverable. Correct. So typically with commodities, there would be physical delivery. But here we had something which was a futures product, but it wasn't deliverable. It was cash settled.
Well, yes, and even if you had deliverable things, there were no regulated venues in which to deliver it. We can have discussion about commodities.
And then what about specification?
Oil can be delivered.
No, and specification, right? One of the things that, what makes commodities markets work is that there's a specification. If I say I'm going to give you pork bellies, it can't be a sick, diseased pig. And if I'm going to give you orange juice, it has to be pure orange juice, not made from concentrate, stuff like that. Frozen orange juice has certain things, certain grades required.
Well, yeah, and the issues as far as sort of Bitcoin, whatever, are concerned, it's a bit different in that here what you couldn't deliver were bad, dirty per chain analysis Bitcoin, and that's just a fundamentally new problem.
Yeah, correct. That's a fundamental. Not that we couldn't maybe deal with it, but we didn't even attempt it.
So if there are financial futures where you deliver, digital whatever, digital bonds,
Yeah.
It's all computer records. So it's not. Nobody says, "Oh, these treasury bonds are money laundering." It doesn't work that way.
Correct. It's a fresh problem. Yeah. It's a legit fresh problem. Yeah. So. I was surprised to see that CME and CBOE got the green light to do Bitcoin futures. Fine, whatever. That's water on the bridge. Now, but that would let the cat out of the bag because what that means is that if you have that futures you could technically make an ETF out of it, because we know that, and there is a path to follow to get that done.
And you can't really reject the underlying that is a CME listed futures. I mean,
Exactly.
that would be absurd.
Correct, because then what would the argument be? This is not legitimate, but oh wait, hang on, the CFTC approved it, so
it's a CME
so that's why that whole can of worms is opened up. So when it came down to the ETF applications based on spot and based on futures, and I argued for this, I said that it would be very challenging to reject the spot BTCs, because the same considerations and the same concerns that you had with respect to a spot one applied for one that's based on futures. And the other issue I had was that I thought the SEC was pretty lazy in its rejection of the spot-based ETFs, and I knew that was going to haunt them.
I mean, they wrote one very detailed piece once, and then ever since then it's just been
exactly.
Which, I mean, if they had come out and said, we're concerned about the inability to do KYC AML work on the delivered coins, but then the ICE listed ones were back delivered that had some limited KYC process. So at that point, it's all just totally sort of intellectually untenable.
Yeah. So I thought that, if they had been a little bit more rigorous, I guess is the word I'm looking for. If they had been a bit more rigorous at the start, but granted, these things tend to unfold, and the SEC presumably had bigger fish to fry. There was a lot of stuff going on, but because of that sort of tardiness, if you will, in the early stages, is why we're seeing what we're seeing today. Because these chickens are coming home to roost, and that's why that Court of Appeal decision on the ETF to say, hey, SEC, go back and take a look at it.
Well, if you want to argue something that at first blush looks a little bit challenging and difficult to possibly understand, maybe be a bit more clear about exactly why.
Correct.
That's not crazy, right? That's not crazy. Whether the decision comes back and ultimately can or can't, whatever.
Yeah.
But that's not crazy.
But it's a bit like, you go to the teacher and you hand in your homework. It's like, yeah, you got the answer. How do I know you didn't copy from somebody else? You got to go back and give me the working for it.
It's a problem I had in math class all the time. Not because I was copying the answer, but...
But yeah, you have to come back and show me how you derived the answer. And if you have a legitimate reason as to how you derived the answer, that's fine. Yeah. It will give you the points that you need. Now, the problem, though, I think, for the SEC at this stage is that I know that they definitely are inclined to reject a spot-based...
I mean, the position they've taken, it's akin to the Coinbase position on their issues. It's been, whatever, our view is that this thing is not okay. Coinbase's view is it is okay. And it's just an absolute, this is not okay, and we're going to find a way to make it not be okay. I'm not entirely sure that's how they're supposed to act. They're allowed, whatever. But they now have to come up with a very detailed... They have to back down, and... I mean,
I would
government
say
normally gets to be more aggressive than...
Correct. I would say it would be challenging, but nonetheless... I think they'll make a stab at it, and I think it's really early to say that, which is what some of these headlines I'm reading, which is why I'm a bit flabbergasted, which is that some of these headlines say, spot Bitcoin ETF has been approved. No, that's not what happened. The Court of Appeals did not rule that Grayscale's GBTC vehicle has been approved to be an ETF.
Their CEO was asked on TV the next day, and he didn't seem terribly excited about pushing this as hard as possible.
Let's talk about that. Now, why would
he said he didn't even know if they had to refile.
Correct.
Which doesn't... You'd have thought if you really wanted your product done at 9:01 the following morning, every time the SEC
you would have everything ready to go.
You'd be ready to go, yeah.
So now this goes back to some stuff that we've written about at length. Go check out the Medium page. Check out the blogs. Why do you think that is?
So they have an egregiously large fee. It's 2%. Yeah. Now, I should say, it feels egregious to me, but it was disclosed. So who's paying the fee? Good luck.
Yeah, correct. I mean, you knew what you were signing up for. Yeah.
And if they convert to an ETF, everybody's just going to pull the money and put it in something else. Because they're not only going to approve one ETF, at least not over some narrow period of time. That's definitely not happening. There's no chance only one ETF gets approved. So people will pull all their Bitcoin and then go stick it in something with lower fees. Or Grayscale will massively cut its fees to not lose all their AUM. Their money is AUM times fees. And that number, as soon as this is approved, is going to go off a cliff.
Correct.
And where does all of the money that DCG has to pay back its creditors come from? We'll come to more detail on that later, but Grayscale salaries, expenses, whatever, entirely come from these fees. And that entire conglomerate's money comes entirely from these fees. So it is hard to see the guy that runs Grayscale wanting to have his revenue slashed by 99%. That's just not a normal thing to do.
And you can see that in the sense that there was just reluctance. And I wrote about this.
Yeah, he should have been ready immediately.
Correct.
As a GBTC shareholder, I'd have been furious. I'm not a GBTC shareholder. That dude had no idea how to fix this problem in the morning. That's insane. Yeah.
I wrote a Medium piece about this some time ago, and I actually wrote down that that they had never really ever wanted to apply for an ETF.
I think most people think that they didn't really want to. They just wanted to make a bunch of noise.
Correct. They never ever really actually wanted to do it. And now they've got a problem because you're going to see in real time that they won't.
Well, but if they don't want it and the SEC doesn't want it, right, it'll be
I think we're on
interesting. No, if we end up with some kind of third-party investor, whatever group trying to intervene to push for it, if Grayscale keeps fumbling their meetings with the SEC intentionally to postpone this, there's a non-zero chance that somebody external has to come in and say, we represent the aggrieved investors in this product. If Grayscale comes out and makes some kind of comment about how they're not actually going to pursue it because of lack of regulatory clarity, in my view, the discount should go to 99%, right? Because if they're not even going to try, then...
I think what they'll do is they'll make a lot of noise. They'll take a long time about it, and then they probably won't go forward.
They'll consult with the SEC. The SEC will appeal it. They'll allow the appeal, and they'll both agree to like the longest possible. Because also, on some level, SEC management might want to not have to make all the final versions of these decisions.
Yeah.
And if Grayscale management's happy to milk the fees for a while, those two groups have aligned interests, not in the same direction as the investors in the product, but they're aligned with each other at least, which is... an interesting situation.
Rare,
everybody's gotten themselves
rare in this
into.
space.
It is rare that the fund manager and the regulator have a highly aligned interest in the opposite direction from the fund manager's investors. But that is exactly what you're looking at here. So.
Strange times. Okay, let's talk a bit about the US Treasury Department. They promulgated 226 pages of proposed rules.
Well, it's a mixture of proposed rules and requests for
comment.
Correct,
and requests for I was going to get to that. And requests for comment. I'm pretty sure you didn't read it, but well, guess who did?
Well, so first of all, while it is 200 whatever pages long, an awful lot of it is not really substantive, and you have to read carefully because it just refer to the rules here, refer to the rules here, refer to the rules here. So if people feel like skimming, it's not too bad. There are substantive sections. So the most interesting for me parts of it concern how they're going to determine what is and is not a U.S. person or a thing subject.
That bit's tricky.
It is certainly true that if you transact euros outside of the United States, the U.S. government has basically no interest in.
They don't give a shit.
Some limited OFAC exceptions in some cases, but and only extreme like North Korea nuclear weapon programs type stuff. Do they assert any kind of interest in what's going on there? And there are questions about where an unincorporated decentralized protocol exists legally. It is not clear, right? You can't say it just doesn't exist anywhere, and you're gonna not get very far telling governments it's just wholly outside.
No, I know what they'll do. Fly. Like a DAO actually exists inside each and every one of us. We just have to look deep enough, and we'll find our DAO.
Okay. Anyway, that's a very old Chinese book. But Tao. My pronunciation's not correct. Anyway. So there are a large number of rules in there establishing how you work out if something is or is not under U.S. jurisdiction, is presumptively under U.S. jurisdiction, what the documentation rules and procedures are for figuring out if something's under U.S. jurisdiction. And those, I think, are the most substantive and interesting part and relevant for, industry trading practitioner activity. There is a framework in which you can establish that somebody's not U.S. whatever regulated subject to rules. Those rules are maybe not ideal. In one case, there is a presumption that you're under the U.S. regime if most of the funds in your wallet came from wallets that you believe are associated with things that are in the U.S. regime. If I withdraw all my money from Citibank in the U.S. to Barclays in the U.K., that should no longer be within the U.S. So that is a little bit weird. That particular clause I do think is a little bit of an overreach. They do specifically ask for comments on this issue.
And we have commented.
But most of the stuff, like it's a company incorporated in the United States, the product is regulated by a regulator
stuff that makes sense.
States.
Like it's sensible stuff that anybody well, I mean, the British call this the club omnibus. Like the
Yeah.
reasonable man would accept. Oh, okay, that makes sense. These are sensible rules.
If the Dow is incorporated in Delaware, it's subject to American rule. Yeah. But there is, 10, 20%, whatever. In one case, there are 5 clauses on something, and part of Clause 4 seems a bit much. They do ask about it. But these rules do not seem like a framework that's totally crazy to me. Now, whether they're going to try to or eventually come up with something that pushes a bit far, maybe. But look, if your strategy for setting up your DAO was to incorporate in the U.S. and raise money from U.S. investors, you're going to be subject to U.S. rules. Similarly, if you're an OTC desk, but your customers are affiliated with U.S.-based exchanges or investment firms, you're not going to be able to get out of these rules.
I guess
if you onboard a person who says they're from Grenada and you have a bunch of paperwork establishing they're from Grenada, and the U.S. comes back later and says, well, they transferred all the money out of Coinbase before they paid you. Yeah, fair enough. There needs to be a way for you to say, I followed a process.
Correct.
We're done. You also need to follow that process in good faith and have it written down and do stuff sensibly. I suspect there may be some pushback on the level of, well, I don't want to have any written rules and keep records. That isn't going to fly here because the U.S. Treasury is not interested in those opinions.
I guess one way to look at it is that if you want to suck on the sweet teats of the U.S. dollar, right, and get money from U.S. investors, you have to be prepared that, Uncle Sam's going to come for his piece.
I mean, you can deal U.S. dollars offshore with people you've established are offshore, if you're offshore, and basically not have to deal with the U.S. government. Again, the basic North Korea terrorist type stuff.
Absolutely,
because it does. Whether you think that's right or wrong, it does. This framework seems like it could be worked into something that's okay, and like it might not be. And it's going to be fascinating to see what the tenor and the quantity of the comments.
I think if you wanted to look at it as like from a broader perspective, it's like for those people who are afforded the protection of U.S. law, and for those people who are afforded the protection of the U.S. government. So, for instance, let's say now if we were stranded somewhere, we would hope that the Marines would come and get us. They might not. They generally do.
Okay. I'm not sure I
agree. But I mean, they generally try to come in and rescue you and stuff.
No, it's just, you're gonna have to establish that you're offshore and give up the whatever relationship with, which is fine.
Oh, and speaking of which, if you're gonna give up your U.S. citizenship, better make sure that you give that up properly.
Else.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, fair enough. Now, whether this is going to be sufficient for people to sort of blocking U.S. IP addresses is not going to satisfy these rules. That's not going to be enough. You're going to have to make some effort to check information about the wallets, onboard your counterparties. Does this mean you have to do extensive KYC on everybody? Probably not. There are, in fact, even written rules describing how you deal with people who don't provide sufficient documentation. Because, again, already in the financial system, there are people who don't do anything like U.S. standard KYC in offshore dealings, and the U.S. Treasury doesn't pretend to have jurisdiction over you because you don't have the correct forms filled out. There are exceptions. So maybe people are going to have to accept a little bit more. You kind of have to follow rules that aren't really associated with you, just so that those rules aren't associated.
You're right. So let's just get down to brass tacks. Let's think of this in terms of how a crypto bro would think about it. So if I set up a DAO offshore, right? Fine, whatever. It has an entity offshore, and it's permissionless, right? There is a non-zero chance an American's going to use that thing.
Lots of people already block U.S. IP addresses. So there is an acknowledgement that even people who have nothing to do with the United States have to take some actions to prevent themselves from being ensnared in stuff in the United States. And the short answer here is that because you can see the transactions publicly, the U.S. government is already telling you, in its view, blocking IP addresses alone will not be sufficient. Exactly what you have to do? The document is very long and they asked for comments, but they have told you that is not going to be sufficient, and they have given indica of U.S. personhood, U.S. whatever jurisdiction, that extend beyond the IP address. They are reasonably clear and need to be firmed up, but it does not seem like they're going to end up with IP bans being sufficient. I suspect a lot of people there are very unhappy about how historical settlements, BitMEX and whatnot, where essentially their procedure was block U.S. IP addresses. And, that was a serious, they did that, but then they accepted people they kind of knew were U.S. anyway. This is an FTX problem, lots of people problem. Clearly there's unhappiness about that, and the way you're going to get around it is to negotiate a somewhat more aggressive set of rules and then follow them, and then they will leave you alone. But anyway, we'll see how that goes.
Finally, let's talk about the sweetheart deal that Genesis gave to its biggest
Well, okay, so this is a proposed deal between Genesis and the Unsecured Creditors Committee. So you're the former, whatever, insolvency lawyer. So this is the group, that represents the creditors in general? Because you can't have all the creditors in a meeting?
Yep, correct.
Okay, so these guys, I think there's 7 representatives on the committee, something like that. It includes some people from the largest creditors and some individuals, whatever. It does not include, notably, Gemini, the largest creditor, and it's been in negotiations with Genesis, the bankrupt subsidiary of DCG, regarding money DCG owes to Genesis. The deal that has been proposed Genesis is currently owed a historical payment from, I think, May of $630 million. The DCG did not pay.
Yes.
Right? So if they wanted to, they could just have them put into insolvency now.
Correct.
I mean, it's not U.S. business hours, but soon.
Genesis could petition for DCG's insolvency.
And it would just go through. There's no dispute about the nature of it.
But they wouldn't because it's the same entity.
It seems like, and we'll come to more evidence for this shortly, that DCG still sort of basically controls most of this operation.
Yes.
So the deal that they've proposed is that they will put up an initial, within whatever 2 days of signing the basic term sheet, $50 million, and then a few weeks later, $50 million. But the front-loaded payments in the next six-ish months amount to, I think, $275 million. They're owed $630 from May. There is a sort of penalty payment in there that they're supposed to pay up front, but every dollar of the penalty payment gets taken off of the 200 whatever million they owe. So there's no real penalty payment here. So that's extending their historical default. And it rolls it into a 2-year note and a 7-year note, which do have larger coupons. The aggregate principal that they're going to be receiving is a bit less than it was before, but the coupons are much higher, and the PV of the two streams is pretty similar. I don't know what the right discount rate for DCG obligations is, but whatever, 5%, 8%. Think that crypto loans are 6% and the dollar loans are 10%. These numbers, you discount at these kinds of numbers, you get PVs that are, within 10%, 15%, whatever, of the old values. The old loans were 1%. So there's no haircut being taken, and they're being sort of given something like forgiveness or just an extra couple of years to pay back money they already defaulted on.
Yes.
And then there are provisions in the documents. First, the first one is the 2-year piece is a first lien, and then the 7-year piece is a second lien, escalating to a first lien when the first note is paid off. That presumably would make it easier to put them in insolvency and seize their assets if they default again on these notes.
Yep.
But since they could already just put them in insolvency and presumably seize their assets already, I don't know that that's worth very
and bear in
much.
mind, right, DCG's biggest asset at this point, what is it?
It was Grayscale.
Exactly.
So there's some interplay that we're going to come to in a second on that one. Yeah. They have a lien over Grayscale. Well, they could already take this thing and seize control of the account. They don't seem to want to do that. So I'm not sure that increasing the strength of your control over something you already have total control over is of any real value. And DCG has granted what to me look like call options on Bitcoin and Ether, struck at fairly high numbers, in that there are clauses that say that the creditors only experience coin appreciation, only benefit from coin appreciation up to 85K Bitcoin and I think 8,500 ETH. Now 85K Bitcoin for 2 years is a very high number.
Yeah.
For 7 years, I tell you, that option is worth
Yeah.
So I estimate those things to be worth 9-figure amounts of money. So that Genesis is granting to DCG $100 million type, $130 million, whatever, options on Bitcoin. So Genesis is I guess, short Bitcoin in some sense, the creditors.
Yeah.
Or at least shorter. And it gets DCG even longer, which is kind of odd, because if Bitcoin goes up to $80,000, I think everybody can pay back their loans and there's no real problem here anymore, right?
So maybe the 3AC boys make a comeback.
Well, that's probably unlikely. But the recovery scenario here seems to be making the good outcome for everybody even better for DCG.
Yes.
And the bad outcome is also better for DCG because they can just default again.
Of course.
Since he's now paying, Barry, whatever, is now paying 50 million and 70 million type incremental payments.
Yeah.
Well, if the GBTC thing gets approved, they no longer have any money. So he's just going to default and hand them the keys.
Correct.
Right? This is a Florida mortgage in 2008.
No, so like GBTC, let's say they drag out the GBTC thing. ETF gets approved. It goes in. boom, discount goes to 99%.
Yeah. He'll just stop paying.
He'll just
default
stop paying on
penalties.
everything.
Yeah.
He says, sorry, it's a stinking hot mess. I'm walking away from this.
Yeah.
And he still gets to keep the money.
Yeah. I mean, if he could turn this into $50 million every half year for whatever, that's... See how long you can collect the fees, right? You can't collect the fees, stop. I mean, look, the amount of money they're collecting every quarter is pretty similar to the amount of money you got to pay out here every quarter. This is pretty ridiculous.
And mind you, he gets to keep the money in every scenario.
So they have made no attempt to come after him for personal whatever, or for money he's taken out historically. Now here we come to the two sort of most interesting little other bits on the chessboard. The guy that now runs Genesis is not exactly a seasoned, experienced executive. We're not criticizing people. His doesn't have a very long resume and is not in a position to be negotiating multi-billion-dollar deals with large whatever creditors. I mean, when I was at that point and having worked in finance, I have no experience. You have been an insolvency lawyer, so different. But like, this is a challenge.
I wouldn't even pretend. I wouldn't even pretend that I would be able to.
This is not a team that's been through this before. Their advisors are New York traditional finance, whatever advisors. But it looks a lot like they're still somewhat in the pocket of DCG management. This is also alleged by the Winklevoss. And to make it even more clear that this deal is absurd, in U.S. bankruptcy reorganizations of this type, 2/3 of the creditors by dollars and half the creditors by number have to approve for the plan to go through. And they owe what, $3-point-something billion, and the Gemini claim is just shy of $1 billion.
Yeah.
So they have what, 30 of the 33% required to block the deal.
Yeah.
Which means they only need one or two other reasonable-sized creditors. It seems they have other people.
And it seems like they have. Yeah, that's right. It seems like they have a bunch of cronies.
The unsecured creditors committee has nowhere near 66% of the dollar claims on their members.
Not even close.
And the ad hoc committee does seem to have over 33.
Yeah, they can block anything.
It consists of guys with about 30 who are publicly very unhappy and more than 0 other people. So they should be fine. They seem to be well over. So this deal isn't going to get approved. The Winklevoss have already publicly said they don't like this deal. That drags it out further, I guess.
And the irony of all of this is that none of this is illegal. Everything is based exactly, and it's happening exactly the way it was supposed to happen.
I do have questions about how DCG has managed to retain such tight control over Genesis and the unsecured creditors committee. I'm not suggesting anything bad happened. I'm just saying this is weird.
No, I get that.
And
I get that.
I don't know
but
if
it's not an argument I would try to make in court, because it would be very difficult to show that this company was just a sham company and that you basically exercised.
But I would wager heavily that the
I agree.
Private investigators figuring out if anything.
I agree.
It certainly smells a little bit. It may be totally fine, but it is suspicious. It is odd. It's certainly odd.
Yeah,
it's certainly odd.
Right. And on that note, thank you for tuning in. We're looking forward to seeing you again next week. As you can see, we're in a different setting. We just thought we'd mix things up for you guys, keep things interesting. But as usual, if you've got any comments, any questions, any opinions, please hit them up there in the comment section down below. Otherwise, smash that like and subscribe button. We really appreciate it when you do that. Helps the algorithm, helps us get our videos out there. If you think these videos are useful, help us get these videos out there to other people who might find them useful as well. Otherwise, we'll see you again next week, and enjoy the weekend. Bye-bye.